Okay, good afternoon all, and welcome to our fifth Thought Leadership Positive Duty session. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Jaswin Yogaratnam, the Northern Territory Anti-Discrimination Commissioner, and welcoming you all to this session on positive duty, gender identity, demystifying the duty holder obligations. Before I start, just to acknowledge that we're here gathered in the beautiful, and I must say it's a little bit sunny here from where I'm sitting, lands of the Larrakia people, and pay my respects to traditional owners past, present, and rising, and also extend that respect to any First Nations people joining us here today. Now, today's topic, demystifying duty holders' obligations in relation to gender identity, is one of the first other intersectional areas that we're exploring. As many of you know, for those of you who've attended our thought leadership sessions, which we've launched since 2024 last year, we use this session to build the knowledge and network on different aspects of positive duty. As you know, the legislation in Northern Territory, which came into effect in 2024, has 24 protected attributes, and gender identity is one of them. So over the last few thought leadership sessions, we've looked into areas of strategy, how to measure impact of positive duty performance, and we've also taken a deep dive into how some organizations have implemented it from a people, process, systems perspective. So today we're really privileged to have Dr. Anna Cody, a commissioner of the Sex Discrimination Commission from the Federal Commission for Human Rights Commission, join us. Just a bit about Dr. Cody. So Dr. Cody started as the Australian Sex Discrimination Commissioner in September 23. Before this, Dr. Cody had a distinguished career as an academic, as a lawyer specializing in discrimination, and as a passionate advocate for human rights. Her work over the years has included substantial advocacy to various UN human rights committees, where they have reviewed Australia's and other nations' fulfillment of their human rights obligations. More recently, she was the Dean of the School of Law and professor at Western Sydney University for about 4.5 years, leading the education and research impact within the school to better reflect the diversity of the community and intersection of law and justice. Now, just a few housekeeping rules before we kick off. This session, as you have noted, is recorded. At the end of the session, which about 20 or so minutes into Dr. Cody's talk, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. Please use the raise your hand button to sort of ask your questions. And if you've got any other concerns or issues in relation to this topic, please be in contact with the Commission. So with that, over to you, Anna.
Thank you very much, Jaswin, and it really is a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I'm really honoured to be asked to join this webinar and also to join with you and with my colleague, Commissioner Yogaratnam. And I also want to begin by acknowledging the Larrakia people, the traditional owners of the land that you are based on in the Northern Territory and that the Anti-Discrimination Commission is based on, as well as paying my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and they're the traditional owners of the land that I am on. And I pay my respects also to elders past and present, and also to any of you who are First Nations people. And I also wanted to acknowledge the deep pain and grieving that you are going through in the Northern Territory with the death of Kumanjaya, little baby. It has been something that has touched all of our hearts across all of Australia, seeing the way in which the community came together. My deepest sympathies go to you and recognise the time that you are going through and the mourning process that you are going through. So today it's a pleasure to discuss the Australian Human Rights Commission's series of explainers about the rights of trans and gender diverse people in Australia, also our Equal Identities report, and then finally the Northern Territory Your Positive Duty laws and what they could look like in the workplace. So this work and all of our work is grounded in the understanding that trans and gender diverse people have always existed, and that gender diversity is natural and a normal part of human diversity. The ABS, Bureau of Statistics, suggests that less than 1% of the population is trans or gender diverse. The 7th National Survey of Australian secondary students and sexual health in 2021 found that for people aged between 14 and 16, it's a higher statistic, around 7%. And to quote a recent article in the Medical Journal of Australia, trans people are not a moral, philosophical or social issue, they're people. The statement, some people are transgender, is a demographic fact, not an ideological position. So I wanted to talk first of all about our explainers. In January of this year, the Commission launched a series of explainers, fact sheets on the rights of trans and gender diverse people in Australia. We know that in recent years there's been growing opposition to recognising trans and gender diverse people's identity and rights, and concern about how trans people's rights may impact other rights. There's also been a lot of misinformation and disinformation. According to the Ipsos LGBT plus Pride 2025 survey, only 16% of Australians have a friend, a colleague, or a relative who is trans. For most people, the experiences and rights of trans and gender diverse people are hypothetical, and rights of trans and gender diverse people are hypothetical and heavily influenced by both legacy media, but also by social media. So our collective lack of knowledge about gender diversity can often contribute to discrimination and exclusion. So the purpose of the explainers is to try and provide easy-to-read information about Australian law and international human rights obligations and how they apply to trans and gender diverse children and young people, as well as adults. So we brought together evidence and Australian law to show how the human rights of trans and gender diverse people are protected in practice. We provide easy-to-read guidance on key legal concepts and include a better understanding of the lived experience of trans and gender diverse people. So we cover common topics such as the laws, systems and policies that protect human rights, such as federal and state laws about changing sex markers on documents and the anti-discrimination law, and how trans and gender diverse rights are recognised in Australian law. We also discuss the difference between gender identity and innate variations of sex characteristics, also known as intersex variations, because often there's a lack of understanding about the difference between those, and also how the rights of trans and gender diverse people interact with the rights of cisgender people, and the health and legal rights of children, trans children and young people, and how they align with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. We don't provide clinical or legal advice in the explainers. And we've received strong feedback about these being useful documents, easy to read and understand on key issues which people can use in their work and in their lives. So I recommend having a look at those. They are short and easy to be used. The second area I wanted to discuss in greater detail is around the recent launch of our report, Equal Identities. I'll try and show you the copy. Doesn't really come up there. Oh, no, doesn't really come up. But it's on our website, so go to and have a look at it. So on March 31st, which is the International Day of Transgender Day of Visibility, we launched our Equal Identities report, which is a human rights review of trans and gender diverse people's experiences in Australia. So it's a far more extensive document and report than the trans explainers. We had held consultations across Australia, including in Darwin in 2025, with LGBTQI+ stakeholders, and they talked to us about the increasing threats to trans and gender diverse rights as an urgent priority. So this report comes out of a 2-year research project with the aim of mapping some of the challenges to the human rights of trans and gender diverse people, also identifying what needs to change in our law. We received over 97 public submissions and also reviewed academic literature. Guided by the submissions, the 13 key areas of focus were divided into 3 themes: being safe, being seen and heard, and being able to participate. And under being safe, it was around violence, harassment and intimidation, online violence, forcibly displaced people, justice, policing and imprisonment and housing. Under being seen and being heard, which we saw as being around dignity, was around data and research, health and wellbeing, gender affirming healthcare, legal recognition of gender, and being able to participate the issues that relate to trans and gender diverse people's ability to take part in public life, such as religion, education, employment, and in sport. And what we found is that we've come a long way in ensuring that trans and gender diverse people can fully realise their human rights, but that they still face significant barriers to their full participation in society and to safety. So first I'll turn to the area of being safe. When we look at threats to personal safety, Equal Identities found that many trans and gender diverse people have to navigate unsafe environments, both in person and online. So simply being trans or gender diverse, even having a diverse gender expression, can jeopardise people's safety in private and public life, including from institutions designed to protect people. Daryl, I can see that you've got your hand up. We were going to take questions at the end. Is that okay? Or it might be an accidental hand up, but we will take questions at the end. So in our review of research, we noted that a community survey by the Trans Justice Project in 2023 found that 1 in 2 trans and gender diverse people experienced anti-trans hate in the last year. We know that research from the E-Safety Commissioner found that among trans and gender diverse children, that 81% had experienced cyberbullying, 75% had seen online hate in the last 12 months, and 38% had experienced non-consensual tracking, monitoring or harassment. And we heard about the concerning rise in rhetoric and actions that devalue and dehumanise trans and gender diverse people, and how that emboldens anti-trans violence and hate. One submission from a trans individual told us, "We're constantly exposed to vicious and hateful rhetoric from anti-trans individuals that attempt to dehumanise us and paint us as a threat. They think nothing of inciting illegal behaviour, and they deliberately create the impression that trans people are not entitled to move freely in the community as citizens. They brag online that there'll be results detrimental to trans people from court cases that they're involved in. All of the threats are pointing to escalation. Violence is very close and has already appeared in specific settings." And we heard about the impact of this anti-trans hostility through our submissions. Some organisations talk about the resources that they required to deal with that and the distress felt by staff when events and services have been targeted, leading to increased security, reduced visibility and stifling respectful and meaningful discussion. It also can impact on trans and gender diverse people's access to education and secure employment, and that housing insecurity is a serious concern. Private Lives 3, which is also a national study, found in 2020 that 1/3 of trans men, trans women and non-binary people had experienced homelessness, a rate much higher than the non-trans community. And we heard that trans people in prison, especially trans women, were also found to be at high risk of violence, including sexual violence, and that the justice system was discriminatory and harmful for many, with many reporting misgendering and other forms of humiliation and discrimination. We heard that despite well-established disparities in health and wellbeing outcomes, experiences of violence and assault and other barriers, that trans and gender diverse people are rarely considered or counted in the development of policies, services or programs that affect their lives. So we made 6 recommendations in relation to this area of being safe. One was the importance of strengthening protections from vilification, incitement of hatred and threats of physical harm. Also to address gaps in legal services for trans and gender diverse people, and ensuring that trans and gender diverse people can access inclusive crisis accommodation and homelessness support, and also that we have mechanisms within government so that LGBTQI+ people have a say in policies, programs and initiatives that directly affect their lives, including responding to hate crimes. The second section, which was around being seen and heard, found that trans and gender diverse people still face challenges being counted, being seen as their affirmed gender, and that strips them of their dignity, not being counted in research and data collection. A researcher submitted that the worlds of politics and policy making rely on data, and that when there are knowledge gaps, they impact on the policy, the practices and the funding for these populations. And it also creates a vacuum where misinformation and disinformation can spread. There are also barriers to accessing healthcare. Walken Cuttagin's research on LGBTQI+ and sister girl and brother boy Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people found that intersecting marginalisation magnified barriers to healthcare. So from them we heard that 28% of their participants had been made to feel that they mattered less when accessing a mainstream health service because they were Aboriginal and LGBTQI+, but that they fell also within the gap that when they accessed LGBTQI+ specific health services, then 40% had heard rude or hurtful comments about their Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander identity. So that ongoing exclusion, that connection between the two, can result in trans and gender diverse people having poorer physical and mental health outcomes. And we heard that that could also mean that some trans people didn't want to access healthcare services at all. And another point to make around access to healthcare was that trans and gender diverse people experience poorer health, not because they are trans, but due to social exclusion and persistent, sometimes violent and dehumanising discrimination in many domains of life. And despite strong evidence that gender-affirming surgeries can be life-saving for trans and gender diverse people, there are still many barriers. And some of those barriers are lack of availability of gender-affirming healthcare service providers, long wait times, a lack of GPs who were aware and understood trans and gender diverse people, limitations on Medicare coverage, and limitations on private insurance coverage. And that many trans and gender diverse people also experienced conversion practices in medical settings. And we heard from a wide range of perspectives also about the availability of gender-affirming care, especially for children. We heard about doctors who provide that healthcare being targeted and harassed, and heard concerns about children's capacity to consent and the impact of the Cass review in England on the situation in Australia. Equal Identities reviewed the best available evidence around medical treatment and centred the rights of the child, including the right to health, the right to wellbeing, and the right to have decisions made in their best interest. We found that the ongoing politicisation and persistently negative media coverage of gender-affirming healthcare for trans and gender-diverse young people causes significant distress to young people and to their families. The third area, so that our recommendations coming out of this section of the report were around the importance of collecting demographic data, that the government should collect that demographic data and follow the ABS standard for sex, gender and variations of sex characteristics and sexual orientation to make sure that those communities are included in our data. Also, that the trans and gender diverse people and communities are represented in the development of health policies and programs, that healthcare providers and training institutions receive training on inclusive care, and that state, territory and federal governments introduce or amend legislation to ban conversion practices, also reducing barriers to all forms of healthcare, including gender-affirming healthcare, and ending pauses on hormone therapies, and to ensure that healthcare for trans and gender diverse children and young people is held to the same standard of other areas of adolescent medicine. So then the third area of the report was around being able to participate. and the rights of trans and gender diverse people being able to participate in all areas of our society. And the four most prominent areas are religion, education, employment and sport. And we heard that at least 7% of young people between 14 and 16 said that inclusive education is still contested, and that under federal law, under our Sex Discrimination Act, private schools and religious education institutions still can discriminate against trans and gender diverse students, and that can create a culture of discrimination and bullying. We heard of secondary students who'd heard negative language about gender identity, and less than 8% knew about anti-bullying policies, and the high rates of depression and anxiety, around 3 in 4 trans young people experiencing that in their lives. In relation to the workforce, we heard about 47% of trans men and 46% of non-binary people reporting an income below the poverty line, so really low wages for this community, and that the trans and gender diverse community experience an unemployment rate 4 times higher than the general population. Also, the higher rates of the experience of workplace sexual harassment. The Australian National Research Organisation on Women's Safety found that 80% of transgender people had experienced workplace sexual harassment. We know that it's a cycle, that the data does exist about trans and gender diverse people's employment, but that it's not intersectional, that data. It doesn't break down the distinct challenges facing trans and gender diverse people who are First Peoples or who are culturally and racially marginalised or are people with a disability. But that there's that cycle between discrimination in education and healthcare leading to insecure employment and housing, which in turn leads to poorer health outcomes. So they all feed into each other. Some of the drivers for discrimination and violence were rigid ideas around gender and gender identity and gender norms. We see those attitudes in society and in the media that devalue and dehumanise trans and gender diverse people. We also heard in our own study, speaking from experience, about the experience of trans people of workplace sexual harassment. And I'll give an example from that project of someone who I'll call Jay, a non-binary person who uses they, them pronouns. And they moved from a regional town to study psychology in the city and got a job in a chain fast food restaurant. Most of the restaurant workers were also young people, either in high school or studying. And not long after starting, a few co-workers started to ask uncomfortable sexual questions about Jay's gender and private parts. They told other people that Jay was transgender without their permission. One 17-year-old manager even made a transphobic joke in a group chat and tagged Jay. Jay felt singled out and unsafe, but was scared about complaining and that might make things worse. So some of the recommendations coming out of that section of the importance of being able to participate section of our Equal Identities report was the importance of amending the Sex Discrimination Act to get rid of those religious education exceptions, but also to make sure that trans and gender diverse people have equal access to all publicly funded services, and that education departments support an inclusive model for education. And finally, that we get a positive duty in the Sex Discrimination Act to cover sexual orientation, gender identity and variations on sex characteristics, as you have in the Northern Territory. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about the positive duty, which you luckily have in the Northern Territory, which we don't have in other parts of the country. And that Equal Identities report provides some insights into the experiences of discrimination and experiences of inclusion and best practice that are identified in your law. And that's covering the areas of education, work, accommodation, goods, services and facilities, clubs, insurance or superannuation, and also administration of laws and government programs. We know from the one piece of positive duty that we do have in the Sex Discrimination Act that it covers the responsibility on employers or persons conducting a business or undertaking or government entities, the responsibility to eliminate, as far as possible. For us, it's around discrimination on the ground of sex in work context, sexual harassment at work, sex-based harassment, or hostile, creating a workplace that's hostile on the ground of sex, as well as victimisations. So we know that your law goes further and applies to your positive duty law, applies to all of your 24 protected attributes, and that includes gender identity, particularly in relation to sexual harassment and related acts of victimisation. So that means that there's an organisational responsibility to prevent workers and others from being exposed to risks or hazards to their physical and psychosocial health and safety in those 7 areas that I just listed. So the Northern Territory positive duty recognises that individual experiences of workplace sexual harassment can't be neatly separated from the other forms of discrimination that people also face. So that means that applies to gender identity. So that responsibility extends to protecting sister girls, brother boys, transgender, non-binary and other gender diverse people and their associates. And it's more important than ever that we recognise that ensuring the rights and dignity of trans and gender diverse people is all of our responsibility. And that there are several proactive, practical steps that workplaces can take to ensure culturally safe workplaces. And that is respecting trans and gender diverse people's genders, their names, their pronouns, in person and on their systems. That there can be bystander training to build confidence in calling out ambiguous behaviours such as intrusive personal questions. Hiring of trans and gender diverse people in ongoing roles, and regularly sharing pronouns preferences. Having inclusive bathrooms in addition to gender-specific ones, and having inclusive uniform policies, having gender affirmation plans and leave, and providing trans and gender diverse awareness training so that everyone understands what some of these issues are related to. And a training about workplace sexual harassment should address how to identify boundaries between appropriate and inappropriate behaviours and calling out some of those ambiguous behaviours as sexual harassment. And making sure that an organisation collects data on trans and gender diverse people. We know that discrimination can come not only from colleagues and managers, but also from clients or customers, third parties. So making sure that there are clear codes of conduct, proactive zero tolerance policies regarding abusive behaviour from clients and training for staff on bystander intervention. All of these can support a safe culture for trans and gender diverse people. We all have the right to be safe from discrimination and harassment, and we all benefit when we work together to create safe workplaces. You have an advantage because of your strong laws, but together we can all ensure that trans and gender diverse people are fully included and recognised in our workplaces. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Cody. That was really insightful and very comprehensive in terms of what you've noted from the Equal Identities report, that context of being safe, being seen and heard, and being able to participate. Before we put some questions to you, I put some questions to you, perhaps I'll just go to the audience to see if there are any questions from the audience here, or if there are any comments that you'd like to sort of share with Commissioner Cody. Feel free to raise your hand. Hi, George.
Hey, Jazz. Thanks so much for that. That was a really informative bit of time spent with you. Thank you. What do you think is the hardest part of implementing?
It depends. It depends your political environment, obviously, but there is scope always there's always scope for some action. So depending on where you come from, whether you're working in an organisation where you can drive change and get policies adopted, regardless of the political environment, but also so workplaces, community organisations, sporting organisations that are inclusive, schools that are inclusive, all of those areas are really significant for change. Sometimes getting government change, so getting LGBTQI+, for example, to be represented within government and on advisory groups, having data collection, some of that can take a bit longer because government takes a bit longer to make changes. But we all have our spheres of influence, so it's working within those spheres of influence, really.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, George. Any other questions from our online audience? And I was just curious, so you talked about the proactive practical steps that we can take, and clearly respect is being one of them. And of course, the hiring of transgender diverse people for ongoing roles. From your perspective, having introduced this, especially the Equal Identities report, what have you seen that's changing in workplaces in relation to be more inclusive?
I think that there is a recognition, there's a familiarity now with positive duty and that responsibility in workplaces to take those proactive steps. So even the recognition of that it's too much to expect the burden of that to be carried by an individual, that it really does need to be the employer or the organisation that recognises the barriers and takes those steps to prevent or eliminate the different types of discrimination. And I think it's really interesting, that stat that I referred to at the very beginning, that only 16% of Australians know a trans or gender diverse person. And so it is about familiarising. It's so easy to be fearful or concerned about an area that you're not familiar with. And I think that's one of the huge benefits I've gained in this position, is meeting with so many people in the LGBTQI+ community and the huge variety and diversity within that community as well. So it is the importance of having, as a positive step, employing people who are trans and gender diverse within your organisation, if that's possible, being conscious of that. In the same way that we know having cultural diversity, having First Nations people within our organisations, it brings a richness, a range of perspectives that we otherwise don't hear from. So being really conscious about that in our hiring processes, and also making sure that there's the support around people so that they can stay in those organisations. So that I think those are really important steps that we can take. And I do think that those are some of the changes, that recognition of the responsibility of employers, particularly to make sure that our society is more inclusive and that it doesn't tolerate, particularly around workplace sexual harassment of anyone, but also just a deeper understanding of what workplace sexual harassment can look like.
Anna, you also talked about the drivers to discrimination, and you talked about, I think, one of the big ones being rigid ideas. And I think that's sometimes, even if it's not rigid ideas, the fear of the unknown sometimes gets people to sort of think of other ways of how they want to react to this. But how have you sort of noted, in terms of dealing with rigid ideas, how do we break down these rigid ideas?
It's a really interesting one, because I think there is a lot of disinformation, because I see LGBTQI+ and trans and gender diverse equality being very connected to gender equality. So for me, there's no conflict between those, and so they are absolutely connected with rigid roles about what a woman is and does and what a man is and does. And so it ties into some narratives that get pushed around that we've already achieved gender equality. And so I think whenever I'm talking about gender equality, and that includes equality for trans and gender diverse people, it is recognising that gender roles restrict all of us, that it is a continuum, that gender, if we think about gender on a continuum, that it limits who I can be friendly with, what subjects I can do at school, what sort of work I might end up doing, who I might have a relationship with. All of those things get framed, and I don't think any of us want it. Who gets to look after children? Who gets to have children? So it limits and constrains all of the possibilities for each of us, no matter where we fall on that gender continuum. So talking about gender equality and equality for gender diverse people and trans people is about freeing up possibilities. And I think that's the really positive piece around trans and gender diverse equality, is that it opens up the really strict containers of gender.
Good points there, and I think in the Northern Territory, just to add to that, so we've got 5 minimum standards for positive duty. It starts with intentional leadership, and then the reporting and response mechanisms, the risk management protocols, then the knowledge and network, which is what we're doing here today, and importantly, the transparency and the continuous learning. And I think the continuous learning, even in the context of this space, is really important because it is an evolving area in terms of how we better understand how to respect, just so we are creating those spaces that are safe and inclusive. But I'm just wondering, from a governance perspective in organizations, what do you see that needs to be changed or considered just to be more inclusive?
So it's going to vary depending on the size of the organisation. If it's a small organisation, then I think leadership is absolutely fundamental. So making sure that leaders are on board, and then it is around culture and how culture gets shaped within an organisation. And then, as you say, one of your standards around knowledge, so that continuous knowledge. So for governance, I think it's who is decision making, who are the managers, who are the directors within an organisation. But if it's in a smaller business, then it's obviously director owner generally. So if it's a bigger organisation, whether it's a community organisation or a government department, then obviously the requirements will be more onerous because they have more resources attached to them. But it is certainly identifying where the risks are, as you talked about that risk management approach, and then responses to any complaints as well, being able to be really responsive and for us as well, trauma informed. So if people do experience discrimination or harassment on those grounds, being really conscious of how we respond to those complaints.
Thanks. And I think the other thing also that you've mentioned a bit in your talk is in relation to visibility, so the being seen and heard. And from an organizational perspective, here's where an effective comms strategy in itself can be a first place to start if you want. I always sort of speak to the broader stakeholder groups to say that what is your 1% that you can start with that's something achievable in the maturity cycle that you're in. And I think thinking about your comms strategy of how, as you've mentioned earlier, the narrative that you want to convey in relation to gender identity and sexual orientation in the organization could be a good place to start. Have you seen that happening in organizations, since you've moved forward with the Equalities and NT report? Have you seen this happening more proactively?
Yeah, I mean, some organisations are further along, always on that journey. So that inclusion, you know, when we think about when you create fact sheets, the images that you use, or making sure that they're inclusive images in your comms strategy. When you're creating fact sheets, making sure to include a range of people within that fact sheet. So really being very conscious about that as a part of any strategy. So that's really important. And then the other thing I think is what we heard around, you know, little things that organisations can do. We heard about in the workplace through the speaking from experience, the importance of people aren't going to talk about who they are and feel comfortable being out in their workplace if there aren't people, you know, little signals like having rainbow flags, having ally material displayed within an office or on a workplace or on a work website, being, you know, people using their pronouns, talking about pronouns, all of those things send implicit messages about this is a friendly environment. In the same way that, for example, we could also have messages around cultural identity, around First Nations identity. So they're all messages that send a clear communication to people about who's welcome and who belongs and whose voice we want to hear in this workplace.
Thank you, Anna. I'm just taking note of there. Any other questions from our online audience? Could you please raise your hands, or any other comments that you'd like to share with Commissioner Cody?
Well, I believe we have Ruby with us as well. I was just checking to check that they were still with us, but if Ruby is at the Human Rights Commission. So, Ruby, if you wanted to add anything in, you're most welcome to, if anyone had any particular questions for Ruby also.
Just to echo around workplace inclusion, and I think Anna spoke a bit about, is just recognizing the way that discrimination can manifest in a lot of different ways that aren't necessarily going to be part of, like, considered as examples in policy. And so it does become really important with the Speaking from Experience report, for example, just to understand how difficult it is for people to come forward if what they've experienced is very much targeted on a particular marginalized identity that they have. And that also makes them more vulnerable. Perpetrators do weaponize that vulnerability because they know it's difficult. ADRO's, the research, when they did their their speaking out report, and also in that example from Speaking from Experience that I've shared in the chat, people might mistake if someone is just showing a lot of, if you can't see I'm doing air quotes, curiosity about someone's body parts, and recognizing how inappropriate it would be for a cisgender man, a non-trans man, to ask a cisgender woman about her genitals or her parts, and why that might be seen as more permissible or more acceptable if it's being asked of a trans person, or for a queer person to being asked about their relationship, but then that leading on to questions about asking questions about how they practice intimacy in their sex lives. Like, those things can be really hard to address within really rigid frameworks. That's why I also think bystander intervention training can be really helpful. So you feel confident and have your capacity to kind of step in if you think things are in this vague, ambiguous area where someone might be uncomfortable, but they might not think it's worth making a complaint about. So just to recognize that once we understand these issues more, it becomes much easier to see, and that also takes all the effort off the individual who's experiencing the harassment or the discrimination.
Thanks, Ruby. I think that point on bystander intervention is really critical in terms of talking about proactive steps versus the bystanders that actually initiate those proactive steps sometimes in relation to creating that safe space, but also then bringing about those other changes, whether from a governance perspective or other standards that need to be implemented. Anna, you also talked about the demographic data and the fact that needs to be included. And taking note, I'm just talking from a territory perspective, but you can share more broadly, perhaps, some of the forms, like when we go, in terms of filling out these forms when you're going to get a health check, etc., may not necessarily even have that selection box for you to tick in relation to
non-binary.
Yeah. So could you speak to that from your...
Yeah, it is absolutely an issue that we have seen, and it really, all organisations, medical practices, schools need to be conscious of these issues. Just having said schools, religious schools are exempt at a federal level, but certainly the state public schools are all bound by this. The importance of having those possibilities for people who want to identify as non-binary, who don't want to necessarily tick male or female. So having the options is a requirement on those forms, and we need to be conscious of it as well. We too easily fall into those binaries. I know I certainly can as well. So it's being conscious of that and seeing that implemented across all of our forms, because it sends such an implicit message of we don't see you. We don't see you if we can't even record you. So it's really important to be aware of that for any of us in those leadership positions, to change the documentation. And that's certainly one of our recommendations about the importance of LGBTQI plus people as advisors within government departments to shape some of the policies and programs to ensure that trans and gender diverse people are included, but even at that basic level of within forms and in documentation, that there is that capacity to be recorded. And we hear good practice. For example, some universities, I was hearing about a university recently that now has complete capacity for student cards, ID cards, and computer systems to record someone's identity as they want to record it and their name as they want to have it listed. So if it's possible from one university, then it's certainly possible across all universities and other institutions.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that goes towards showing organizational responsibility. And I think in addition to that, while that may be a small thing to do in terms of those changes, but it goes a long way towards the psychosocial safety. And I think here is where organizations who want to demonstrate psychosocial safety performance in relation to their other WHS sort of obligations, you can also achieve that through your positive duty obligations. And only because in the territory we have positive duty for these other attributes. And I guess the other point, Anna, is that, considering the NT, we've got 24 protected attributes. And when we talk about gender identity, we are also talking about gender identity in relation to someone with disability, someone who's an older person, and these intersectional contexts speaks in relation to the other risk factors that people within that space with the added intersectional dimension adds towards them feeling safe or unsafe. Do you want to speak to that at all, the interactions between other attributes?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is so important to recognise the complexity of any community, that we're not just one identity, that we have a range of identities contained in who we are. And so making sure that when we're thinking about trans and gender diverse people, we're thinking about young people, children and young people who are trans and gender diverse, First Nations people who are trans and gender diverse, people with a disability. So making sure that when we're making policy in one particular area, that we have a full version of that. So it is really important. So, for example, the gender inclusive toilets, being aware of having a toilet that's available for someone who's non-binary, but that can also help for people who have children, for example. So making sure that that we have those services available and provision of those facilities. So it is really important, and we know, particularly culturally, racially marginalised trans and gender diverse people, that they will have a particular experience, particularly if they've come from, if they're a refugee or migrant background, then we know that the experience in their country of origin might be different, how they will have experienced their family, you know, depending on whether they come from, say, the Pacific, which has a generally strong very generalising, strong and affirming experience of trans and gender diverse cultures, but in other countries less so. So it really will shape someone's cultural background, and trans and gender diverse status will really shape their experience of access to education or access to healthcare. So really being conscious of those subtleties and the ways in which people experience their lives.
Thanks, Anna. Just going around the screen again to see if there are any hands up or any final questions or comments or observations. Does anyone want to share?
Ruby's put some fantastic links, and I can see everyone's really appreciating those in the chat. So I would really encourage you to copy and paste as many as you can before you lose the connection.
Yeah, thanks, Ruby. I think one last point before we conclude, Anna, is just in relation to that thinking in relation to gender identity and trans rights, that we sometimes pigeonhole it into the health context, but actually we're looking at it from a human rights perspective. And do you want to speak about, how we should be framing it in that space?
Well, it's recognising that we all, because we're people, have human rights, and that those come from our essential human nature, that they were codified for many years, but in the most recent version after the Second World War, that we have those rights. And so how important it is to think about all of us, and that's about the right to participate, to vote, to be free from discrimination in healthcare and education. And so how important it is that we then are able to exercise those rights. You don't have a Human Rights Act in the Northern Territory, neither do many of the states and territories. Certainly Victoria does, ACT and Queensland, but other states and territories don't. But it is important for us to think about trans rights in relation to education. So making sure that teachers are aware of how to create inclusive learning education institutions, that we are counted. So within our census, within our ABS statistics, that we're included, that trans and gender diverse people are included, making sure they're included in the framing of policies around housing, for example, or access to housing, crisis accommodation. So it is more than just healthcare. It is thinking broadly around how trans and gender diverse people live their lives, play sport, engage in their religion, go to temple, go to church, and how they're accepted and welcomed within that.
Wonderful. And that sort of brings us towards the end, Anna. I think you've answered that question really well, but also adding to that context, that is the reason why in the Northern Territory, it's so important that we celebrate the fact that we have positive duty for about 24 protected attributes, because we can look at the person as a whole and not just in the context of that one attribute that the person registers with. And I think that's another way of how we also are moving forward towards protecting those important human rights. I think the positivity framework in the territory provides that capacity, but also that ambition towards moving towards that human rights protection in the territory, but also possibly in the future a Human Rights Act for the NT. So there is hope in that space. So
maybe Australia-wide one day.
And we certainly will sort of look out for the federal position in that space, and as we do look out for broader positive duty attribute protection at the federal level with the journey that you're taking. Look, really, really thankful to you, Commissioner Cody, and also to Ruby for all your help in putting this together. I think there's a lot of nuggets that you have shared with us in terms of what we can do at the workplace level, in terms of, number one, shifting that responsibility, but importantly, not just the responsibility, the attitudes and the behavior change that we need to sort of cultivate within the environment. Because when we talk about positive duty performance at the workplace, it is not just about ticking those boxes, and clearly we want to have those pronouns in, but for people to mean it, to respect it, just so we are creating those safe spaces and the psychosocial safety that we are aspiring to in our organizations. So with that, thank you everyone for joining us in this session. As you've noted, this session is recorded and we'll be using it for educational purposes down the line. If you want to continue the conversation, feel free to sort of engage with the Commission, or if any other questions for Commissioner Cody, feel free to email us and we will put it to her and her team. Thank you so much, Anna and Ruby, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you very much, Jeswin, an absolute pleasure. And thanks for your really engaged questions and thoughtfulness. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.